Attention! Prepare yourself for a deep journey into one of the most macabre and disturbing cases in the history of Haverhill, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I ask that you write in the comments down below where you are listening from and what time it is at this exact moment. In the winter of 1901, a physician named Duncan Alexander McDougall returned to his native Haverhill after spending 7 years studying medicine in Edinburgh. The city along the Merrimack River had transformed into an industrial centre, its factories producing thousands of boots daily. Its streets crowded with immigrants seeking work. McDougall established his practice on Washington Street, in a narrow 3-story building that once housed a cobbler's workshop. The structure leaned slightly to the left, a consequence of the poor foundation common in buildings erected during the shoe manufacturing boom of the 1880s. The upper floor, where McDougall lived, smelled perpetually of damp wood and the chemical residue from the tanneries that lined the river. What his neighbours did not know was that McDougall had returned from Scotland with an obsession. During his final year in Edinburgh, he had attended a series of lectures by a physiologist who claimed that consciousness was nothing more than chemical reactions, that the human being was merely an organic machine. McDougall found this notion unbearable. He believed, with absolute certainty, that something immeasurable existed within the body, something that could not be reduced to nerves and tissues. He called it substance. His colleagues in Edinburgh had considered him eccentric but harmless. In Haverhill, no one knew about his theories. The building McDougall rented had once belonged to a physician named Elias Hewitt, who had died under circumstances that were never fully clarified. According to property records archived at the Essex County Registry of Deeds, Hewitt's widow sold the building in 1898, just 2 months after her husband's death. The sale was conducted hastily, and the price was notably below market value. When McDougall moved in, he found medical instruments abandoned in wooden crates in the basement, along with patient files that appeared to have been deliberately burned. Only fragments remained, pages with names and dates charred beyond recognition. McDougall kept these remnants in a metal box, though he never explained why. In the spring of 1902, McDougall began visiting nursing homes across Essex County. He claimed to be conducting a study on respiratory patterns in terminal patients. The administrators of these institutions, most of them run by religious orders, saw no reason to deny him access. McDougall was courteous, well-dressed, and had impeccable credentials. He would spend hours at the bedside of dying patients, taking notes in a leather journal that he kept locked in his medical bag. No one questioned what he was writing. What McDougall sought were patients who met very specific criteria. They needed to be in the final stage of a wasting disease, preferably tuberculosis or acute diabetes. They needed to be conscious enough to provide consent, yet weak enough not to move during what he described as the critical moment. Above all, they needed to have no family who would ask too many questions. In an era when tuberculosis claimed thousands of lives annually in Massachusetts alone, such patients were not difficult to find. Many were immigrants who had arrived alone in search of work. Others were elderly individuals whose relatives had already died or moved west. During that summer, McDougall commissioned a peculiar piece of equipment from a machinist in Lawrence, a city 15 miles south of Haverhill. The device was a bed mounted on a platform scale, sensitive enough to detect weight fluctuations of 0.2 of an ounce. The machinist, a man named Walter Cobb, later told his wife that McDougall had requested absolute precision, insisting that even the smallest variation could render the entire apparatus useless. Cobb found the request strange, but accepted the commission. He needed the money. His workshop struggled to compete with larger manufacturers. The bed was installed in a room on the 2nd floor of McDougall's building, directly above his consultation office. He covered the windows with heavy curtains and installed a lock on the door that could only be opened from the inside. When patients asked about the purpose of the room, McDougall explained that he was conducting weight studies related to fluid loss during fever. Most accepted this explanation without question. A few expressed unease, but said nothing. In 1902, questioning a physician's methods was considered improper, especially for individuals of limited means who depended on charity care. The first subject was a man named Thomas Brennan, 41 years old, originally from County Cork, Ireland. According to records from St. Joseph Hospital, Brennan had been admitted in August of 1902 with advanced pulmonary tuberculosis. He had worked in a shoe factory on River Street for 12 years, living in a boarding house near Railroad Square. He had no wife, no children, and no known relatives in the United States. When McDougall approached him with a proposal to participate in a medical study, Brennan agreed. He was told he would receive better care and that his final days would be more comfortable. McDougall assured him the procedure was painless. On the afternoon of September 6, 1902, Brennan was transported to McDougall's building. Two assistants, whose names were never recorded in official documents, carried him up the narrow stairs to the second-floor room. Brennan weighed 109 pounds. He was placed on the bed, and the scale was calibrated. McDougall sat in a chair beside the bed, his journal open on his lap, a pocket watch in his hand. He instructed his assistants to remain silent and motionless. The room was warm, despite the approaching autumn. The curtains blocked all light except for a single kerosene lamp on a small table. Brennan died at 6:43 in the evening. McDougall recorded that the weight dropped suddenly by 3/4 of an ounce, approximately 21 grams, at the precise moment when breathing ceased. He noted that the decrease occurred too rapidly to be explained by the evaporation of perspiration or the loss of moisture through exhalation. In his journal, he wrote that the weight loss was instantaneous, as if something had been lifted from the body. He underlined the word instantaneous 3 times. The following day, Brennan's body was taken to St. Mary Cemetery on Canosa Avenue and buried in an unmarked grave. No funeral service was held. According to parish records, the burial was listed as a charity case. McDougall paid for the plot himself. He told the cemetery administrator that Brennan had been a patient who died without means, and that it was his Christian duty to ensure a proper burial. No one questioned this. It was common for physicians to cover burial costs for indigent patients. Over the next 9 months, 5 more individuals were brought to the second-floor room. Their names, ages, and causes of death were recorded in McDougall's journal, but the document was never made public during his lifetime. 3 of the subjects were men suffering from tuberculosis. One was a woman with diabetes, and another was a man whose illness was described only as a wasting condition. All were terminal, all were alone. None had anyone who would search for them after their deaths. The second subject died on October 21st, 1902, the third on January 14th, 1903, the fourth on March 8th of the same year, the fifth on April 17th. The sixth and final subject died on June 2nd, 1903. McDougall's notes indicate that each experiment followed the same protocol. The patient was placed on the bed. The scale was calibrated, and McDougall waited. The weight changes he recorded varied. Some subjects lost weight gradually, others suddenly. One subject gained weight briefly before losing it again. Only Brennan's case showed the sudden, dramatic drop that McDougall considered definitive proof. But there was something McDougall did not record in his journal, something that would only be discovered decades later. During this period, a nurse named Catherine Walsh worked part-time at McDougall's practice. Walsh was 28 years old, a recent widow whose husband had died in a mill accident. She needed the income to support her 2 children. Her duties involved cleaning the office, assisting with minor procedures, and occasionally preparing meals for McDougall, who rarely left the building. Walsh was quiet, diligent, and discreet. In a letter, written in 1954, found among Walsh's personal effects after her death. She described what she had witnessed during those months. She wrote that MacDougall became increasingly agitated as the experiments progressed. He slept little, ate sparingly, and spent hours in the locked room, even when no patients were present. She claimed to have heard him speaking to someone, though she never saw anyone else enter or leave. Once, she attempted to ask him if he felt unwell, and he responded by staring at her in silence for several seconds before walking away without a word. Walsh also wrote that on 3 occasions she noticed discrepancies in MacDougall's records. The dates he recorded for certain experiments did not match the days when she had seen patients arrive. She recalled one instance in particular. A man who was brought to the building in late February of 1903, but whose death, according to MacDougall's records, was listed as occurring in early March. Walsh did not understand why the dates would differ by more than a week. She considered asking MacDougall about this, but decided against it. She needed the employment. There was another detail Walsh included in her letter, one that she emphasized as particularly disturbing. She wrote that after the final experiment in June of 1903, MacDougall ordered her to clean the second-floor room. When she entered, she found the bed, the scale, and a small wooden chair. Everything appeared normal except for the floor. Beneath the bed, the floorboards were stained dark, as if something had seeped through the mattress. Walsh scrubbed the area for hours, but could not remove the marks. MacDougall told her to cover them with a rug and to never speak of it. She obeyed. In July of 1903, MacDougall ceased all experiments involving human subjects. He did not explain why to anyone. Instead, he turned his attention to animals. Over the next 4 months, he acquired 15 dogs from unknown sources. Neighbors reported seeing him carry large sacks into the building late at night. Some assumed he was experimenting with surgical techniques. Others suspected something darker, but said nothing. In Haverhill, as in many industrial towns of that era, people learned not to interfere in matters that did not directly concern them. MacDougall's methodology with the dogs followed the same protocol he had used with human subjects. The animals were placed on the scale, and their weight was monitored as they died. Unlike the human experiments, MacDougall administered substances to induce death quickly. Precisely what substances he used is unclear, though references in his notes suggest chloroform and possibly strychnine. None of the dogs showed measurable weight loss at the moment of death. MacDougall concluded that animals did not possess the substance he sought to isolate. He recorded this finding without emotion, as if it were a simple matter of scientific observation. Catherine Walsh left MacDougall's employment in October of 1903. She gave no formal notice. She simply stopped coming to work. In her 1954 letter, she explained that she could no longer tolerate the sounds coming from the second-floor room. She wrote that she heard whimpering, scratching at the door, and on one occasion, a sound she described as a low, guttural moan that lasted for several minutes before stopping abruptly. She did not know if these sounds came from the animals or from something else. She did not want to know. For nearly 4 years, MacDougall remained silent about his experiments. He continued his medical practice, treating patients for common ailments, delivering babies, setting broken bones. To the residents of Haverhill, he was a competent physician, perhaps slightly reserved, but otherwise unremarkable. No one suspected what he had done in the locked room on the second floor. No one asked what had become of the patients who had entered the building and never left. In January of 1907, the New York Times published an article with the headline, "Soul Has Weight, Physician Thinks." The article described MacDougall's experiments in detail, though it did not name the location where they had been conducted, nor did it identify any of the subjects. The piece generated immediate controversy. Religious leaders praised MacDougall for attempting to prove the existence of the soul. Scientists condemned him for his methodology, his small sample size, and his selective reporting. The Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research published his findings in April of that year, along with a critical addendum noting the numerous flaws in his approach. What the public did not know, what McDougall himself never disclosed, was that his experiments had not truly ended in 1903. They had only changed. In the years between the cessation of his work with animals and the publication of his results, McDougall continued his research in ways that were not documented, not recorded, and certainly not made public. There are gaps in his personal journals, entire months missing, pages torn out or burned. The few entries that remain from this period are fragmentary and cryptic. One note, dated March of 1906, reads only, "The weight does not return. Where does it go?" In 1911, McDougall announced to the New York Times that he intended to photograph the soul at the moment of death. He claimed to have developed a method using specialized equipment that could capture the departure of the substance from the body. He described light resembling that of the interstellar ether, visible in or around the skulls of dying patients. The announcement generated renewed interest, but McDougall never published any photographs. He never produced any evidence. When pressed by reporters, he stated that the soul substance was too agitated to be captured on film. He promised that further research would yield results. That research never materialized. Between 1911 and his death in 1920, McDougall's life became increasingly isolated. He stopped attending medical conferences. He stopped publishing papers. He rarely left his building on Washington Street. Former colleagues who visited reported that he appeared distracted, as if listening to something they could not hear. One physician, Dr. Harold Pritchard, later told his family that McDougall seemed to have aged decades in just a few years. His hair had gone completely white, and his hands trembled constantly. Pritchard asked if he was ill. McDougall replied that he was not ill, but that he was being watched. There is a record from the Haverhill Police Department, dated August of 1917, documenting a disturbance at McDougall's building. A neighbor had reported hearing breaking glass and shouting late at night. When officers arrived, they found McDougall alone in the second-floor room, the windows shattered, glass scattered across the floor. He claimed an intruder had attempted to break in, though no evidence of forced entry was found. The police filed a report noting that McDougall appeared disoriented and that he refused medical attention. No further action was taken. In 1919, Catherine Walsh received a letter from McDougall. It was the first and only communication she had received from him since leaving his employment 16 years earlier. The letter was brief, written in a shaky hand. McDougall apologized for any distress he had caused her. He wrote that he had made a terrible mistake, though he did not specify what that mistake was. He asked for her forgiveness. Walsh never replied. She kept the letter hidden in a drawer until her death 35 years later. Duncan Alexander McDougall died on October 15, 1920. The official cause of death was recorded as cardiac failure. He was 54 years old. His body was found in the second-floor room by his landlord, who had entered the building after noticing that McDougall had not been seen for several days. The landlord described the scene as deeply unsettling. McDougall was lying on the bed, the same bed used in his experiments nearly 2 decades earlier. The scale was still beneath it, though it had not functioned in years. The room was in disarray, papers strewn across the floor, furniture overturned. On the wall beside the bed, someone had written a single phrase, in what appeared to be charcoal. "It will not leave." No autopsy was performed. McDougall's body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location. His personal effects, including his journals, were placed in storage by his executor, a lawyer named Albert Finch. According to records from Finch's office, the materials were to be sealed for 50 years, until 1970. However, when researchers attempted to access the journals in 1970, they discovered that the storage facility had been destroyed in a fire in 1946. Everything had been lost, no copies existed, no backups had been made. The only remaining evidence of MacDougall's work consisted of the published articles and the brief notes that had been reproduced in medical journals. In 1958, a construction crew demolishing buildings along Washington Street to make way for urban renewal discovered something beneath the floor of MacDougall's former residence. Workers found a wooden crate containing bones. Analysis determined they were human remains, though the identity of the individual could not be established. The bones showed signs of prolonged exposure to chemicals, possibly formaldehyde or a similar preservative. The discovery was reported to the Haverhill police, but no investigation was launched. The remains were classified as historical artifacts, likely related to medical study, and were reinterred in an unmarked location. No further questions were asked. Catherine Walsh's letter, written in 1954 and discovered after her death in 1968, prompted a brief, renewed interest in MacDougall's experiments. A local historian named Robert Fielding attempted to piece together what had truly occurred in the building on Washington Street. Fielding interviewed individuals who had known MacDougall, reviewed property records, and searched for any surviving documentation. What he found raised more questions than it answered. Fielding discovered discrepancies in the burial records at St. Mary Cemetery. Several graves listed as charity burials during the period of MacDougall's experiments were never marked, and their exact locations were no longer known. The cemetery administrator suggested that record-keeping had been inconsistent during that era, and that such oversights were not uncommon. Fielding was not convinced. Fielding also uncovered testimony from a woman named Margaret Lowell, who had worked as a cleaning attendant at one of the nursing homes MacDougall had frequented. Lowell, interviewed in 1964 at the age of 83, recalled that several patients had gone missing during the months in question. She specified that these were individuals without families, people who had arrived alone and whose deaths would not be noticed. When Lowell brought her concerns to the nursing home administrator, she was told that the patients had been transferred to another facility. Lowell never saw records of these transfers. When Fielding pressed for more details, Lowell became agitated and refused to continue the interview. She died 3 weeks later. The most troubling discovery Fielding made involved Walter Cobb, the machinist who had built the scale for MacDougall. Cobb's workshop records, archived at the Lawrence Public Library, included invoices and correspondence related to the commission. Among these documents, Fielding found a letter Cobb had written to his brother in 1908. In the letter, Cobb described a visit MacDougall had made to his workshop 2 years after the scale had been delivered. MacDougall had requested modifications to the device, specifically the addition of restraints that could be attached to the bed frame. Cobb refused, stating that such modifications went beyond the scope of his trade. He wrote that MacDougall became visibly upset and left without another word. Cobb added that he had heard disturbing rumors about MacDougall's experiments and that he regretted ever accepting the commission. Fielding compiled his findings into a manuscript titled The Weight of Silence, an investigation into the MacDougall experiments. He submitted the manuscript to several publishers, all of whom rejected it. The reasons given were consistent. The content was too speculative, the evidence too circumstantial, and the potential for legal liability too great. Fielding's manuscript was never published. He abandoned the project in 1967. The original manuscript is housed in the Haverhill Public Library Special Collections, available only by request. In 1973, a psychology student from Boston University named Elena Vasquez attempted to recreate Fielding's research as part of her thesis. Vasquez focused on the psychological profile of Duncan McDougall, analyzing his writings, his correspondence, and the accounts of those who had known him. She concluded that McDougall exhibited signs of obsessive-compulsive behavior, grandiosity, and a detachment from ethical norms consistent with what would now be recognized as a personality disorder. However, Vasquez also noted something that troubled her deeply. McDougall's writings suggested that he believed his experiments had succeeded. He was convinced he had isolated the substance he sought. But if that were true, Vasquez asked, what had he done with it? There is one final piece of evidence, one that has never been fully explained. In 1949, a patient at the Haverhill State Hospital, formerly known as the Haverhill Asylum for the Insane, made a statement that was recorded in the facility's logs. The patient, identified only by the initials RMB, claimed to have worked as an orderly in a private medical practice in the early 1900s. RMB stated that he had been present during experiments involving dying patients and that he had been ordered to dispose of materials afterward. When staff asked RMB to clarify what he meant by materials, he became incoherent and refused to speak further. RMB died in the hospital in 1951. His real name was never disclosed, and his personal records were destroyed in accordance with the hospital's confidentiality policies at the time. The building on Washington Street where McDougall conducted his experiments was demolished in 1960. The site is now a parking lot. No plaque marks the location. No historical record acknowledges what occurred there. The residents of Haverhill, if they remember McDougall at all, know him only as the physician who tried to weigh the soul. The darker truths, the missing patients, the unmarked graves, the chemical-stained floorboards remain buried beneath layers of time and deliberate forgetting. But there are those who believe the story did not end with McDougall's death. There are accounts, unverified and anecdotal, of individuals who visited the site years later and reported feeling an inexplicable weight pressing down on their chests, a sensation that would not lift until they left. Others have claimed to hear faint sounds, like whispers, coming from beneath the pavement. These accounts are dismissed as urban legends, the product of imagination and suggestion, yet they persist. Catherine Walsh, in her final letter, wrote something that has never been adequately addressed. She described a conversation she overheard in the spring of 1903, shortly before the final experiment. McDougall was speaking to someone in the second-floor room. Walsh could not see who it was, but she heard McDougall say, "If I can prove it exists, then I can control it. And if I can control it, it will never leave." Walsh did not know what he meant. She wrote that she wished she had never heard those words, and that they haunted her for the rest of her life. In the end, what Duncan McDougall sought to prove remains unproven. Whether the soul exists, whether it has weight, whether it can be isolated and measured, these are questions that science has not answered. What is certain, however, is that 6 people entered McDougall's building in the early 1900s and never came out. Their names are lost. Their families never knew what happened to them. They were forgotten by history, reduced to data points in a failed experiment. And somewhere in the archives and forgotten records of Haverhill, Massachusetts, perhaps buried in documents no one has thought to examine, the full truth still waits. It waits in the gaps between official reports, in the silences of those who saw but did not speak, in the weight of what was taken and never returned. The question is not whether Duncan McDougall proved the existence of the soul. The question is, at what cost did he try?